Hello, everyone. My name is Keith Wiley, and this is the housing session for the ACS Data Users Conference 2025. And I really like this session. I do a lot of housing data myself and housing research work, and the ACS is just critical. And I feel it's really important. I can't imagine doing any housing research without actually using ACS data. And we have four presenters here today who are going to present on work they're doing and using ACS data to work on real world housing problems and housing issues. And I think it's just really powerful. And I just really fortunate that I can be here and moderate this session. And we're going to have Brandon Stanaway, and we're going to have Brielle Bryan, and we're going to have Eric Gartland, and we're going to have Natasha Moody, and they're all going to speak. And I will just get a few things out of the way here, and I'm not going to drag on because I could talk about that all day myself. But just if you need closed captioning and is available, please use it. You can use it, and that'll be there for you. Also, the question and answer, the Q&A tab is where we're going to do that. And the format we'll be using is what will happen is I'll just introduce very briefly with just a sentence or two in the topic for each presenter, and then they'll do it, and then we'll go. When they're done, the next presenter will go, and we'll collect all the questions at the end, and then I'll read them, and then they can respond to and give you answers to the questions. I think it works better that way. It kind of keeps it organized, and it doesn't break up so much. And so that's how we'll do it. So please put your questions in the tab. And this materials, they're going to be recorded. So you'll have access to them. And I don't know if you noticed, like at the homepage for the ACS Users Conference, there actually was, you could see where there was the old ones if you were linked to the old presentation. So you'll be able to get this material. And it made me feel old. The conference has been going on a lot of years, and I can remember being here all these years. So you can do that, and it'll give you that information. So don't worry, if you don't take notes, you'll still have access to it. And I'm going to go to the first speaker now, and I'm just going to briefly introduce Brandon Stanaway. And he is a social scientist at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. I think that's in the Boston area. And his research interests include land use, housing, transportation, the labor market, among many others. He uses both quantitative and qualitative research methods, and he seeks to evaluate and improve local and regional land use policies and municipal governance. And I'm just going to turn it over to him. His presentation is going to be on housing headships, kind of like crowding and number of house members in a household. So I'm going to turn it to Brandon. And okay, Brandon.
Thanks, Kate. I'll share my presentation. Cool. Alrighty. So I'm going to give an overview of one of these things that I did for a housing production or a statewide housing plan, where I estimated headship rates after splitting overcrowded households. And I'll explain more about what that means later. So our agenda for this talk, first going to give some of the context around what MAPC is, what regional planning is, as well as that kind of housing situation in the state or in the Commonwealth. Then I'll do a brief literature review of what kind of guided and motivated this research. Go into the methods, where I'll talk more about how I use the ACS PUMS data to do this work. I'll review the results, and then give a little overview of some future research or ways to refine the work that I had done. So like any other state in the country, Massachusetts is facing a housing crisis. This is in part due to rising costs of housing and the types of housing available. And those have led to a decrease in headship rates over time. And what I mean by headship rates are the likelihood of someone forming a household at any point in time. This is kind of due to more people living with households or living with roommates or different family members. And additionally, fewer people are having children, so family households are declining as well. And so the state has kind of passed legislation, and municipalities have passed legislation and ordinances aimed at increasing the housing supply to be able to accommodate for new people who want to move here or who are born here. And so that's kind of where the Metropolitan Area Planning Council comes in to play. We're the regional planning agency for 101 cities and towns in Eastern Massachusetts, and we provide planning and technical support to these municipalities. And I'll plug that MAPC is also part of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is an organization run out of the Urban Institute, which actually helps bring data to local policymakers. And that's kind of the idea behind some of this work as well. And so my team works to help the Boston Region MPO, which is the Metropolitan Planning Agency or organization, to kind of model the effects of population change, household change, and how it impacts different transportation scenarios in the region. And that's kind of where this work usually sits. And that information is used in different housing production plans, water demand forecasting, and other planning projects, which aim to create policies that increase the amount of housing or change the types of housing that are being built. And so we do this every 3 years for these kind of plans, but we were called upon by the state to help work on the first ever statewide housing plan for the Commonwealth. And so MAPC and the team that I work on prepared 4 population and household projection scenarios, which were geared toward estimating the number and type of housing units that the state needs to produce to accommodate the people moving and being born here. And so I'm going to touch on the headship rates that were estimated with splitting overcrowded households that were in our scenario 2 and 3 work. But we also looked at 2017 to 2021 ACS PUMS data for scenario 1, and then we added in some other information for the state shelter system as well in scenario 4. So what makes a household overcrowded? And that's kind of like the motivating research question here. We wanted to understand the fact that there's limited housing, and so more people live in the current housing that's available, and what happens if we were to split out these households if there were enough housing available. And so part of that question is, why do people form these households in the first place? And that is because there are usually more people per bedroom in a household. So think of like, a family living in a 1-bedroom where there's 2 kids and 2 adults. The kids are either sleeping on the couch or whatnot. And then another scenario where people would be overcrowded is when a household has subfamilies. So those are familiar relations that are living with one family or not. So say like your brother or sister and their family in a household that may be overcrowded. And so we wanted to split these out, but we also wanted to consider the fact that some households might be choosing to be overcrowded, that there's some preference or cultural difference that makes people or that are people prefer that kind of scenario. And so one of those considerations is the presence of multi-generational households. So people living with their father and mother and their children in the same household. While they might be overcrowded, they might be choosing that for financial reasons or wanting to be close to family. And also the presence of subfamilies and presence of children also contributes to that. If you're helping to take care of your brother's kids or whatnot, you might want to form a more overcrowded household. And so we classified households, whether or not they were overcrowded, if they were multi-generational, if they have children or subfamilies, into kind of these 2 subsets, for which we broke up the number of households in this splitting technique. And so to be able to do this, there were a couple variables in PUMS that we needed to consider first. So we have the number NP, which is the number of people in households, HP, the age of the person, RMSP, the number of rooms in a housing unit, SFN, which is the subfamily number. So each PUMS record has, if they have subfamilies, they're listed as 1, 2, 3, based on the relation to the householder. The number of bedrooms in a household. We considered studios to be 1-bedrooms for this purpose, just so we had a denominator to calculate the overcrowded number. And then multi-generational. And so this variable, and I'll get into this in the further research, was a little bit not ideal in the way to use it. The census defines multi-generational households are those with 3 generations in them, but there are instances where potentially the understanding of what multi-generational is might change based on the type of household. So say like grandparents with grandchildren living in a household. And then a couple of mutated variables that I created were a child flag, so whether or not anyone in the household is under 18, and then an overcrowded person per bedroom kind of designation. So that's just NP divided by the number of bedrooms. And so the way we split the households, I'll walk through the way here. And so a split household will reflect in the PUMS records. So you have one serial number and there's 7 people in there. One is part of a group of them is part of a subfamily. The split household reflects not only the new household that's created by splitting out the subfamily, but also the original household that is now different because they've been split. And so to create that new split household, there are a couple of steps. Each household has to be assigned a binary indicator, whether or not it should be split, and that was kind of those subsets for those indicators. We had to create a custom serial number for each subfamily in the original household so that we know how many households to split it out to, and then give it a unique identifier. After that, once they're split, we have to reorder the people within those split households in a subfamily, or in a regular PUMS record, the SP order 1 and people afterwards are usually, the SP order 1 is usually an adult who's the head of household or who has responded to the survey. But in subfamilies, we don't have that necessary designation, and so it's important that we arrange based on the typical age of the person in the household. So you wouldn't want a child being the head of household, but if you rearrange it so that the first person represented in that subfamily is an adult, then we can say that it's the first person or the respondent in the household. And then we recreated some of the household variables like household income in the split households. And then from there, we did a little bit of a pacing thing because we're forecasting in this scenario. So like 2030, 2035, 2045. And so we randomly sampled from all of these subsets with the split households to create headship rates essentially for different 5-year periods over time to sort of simulate the change in household formation over time instead of assuming that it's all going to happen in, say, 2035. And then from there, we create a new PUMS data frame for each period based on those split households. And then we calculate household formation rates. And so to explain household formation rates, like I said, they're just the likelihood that someone forms a type of household. And so, for example, we kind of group them into 3 categories for our purposes. And this diagram is just showing the 17 to 21 ACS PUMS calculation, the standard. So we have households with children, which peaks in the 30 to 45 range of 5-year age groups. We have households with multiple adults and no children. So those are like couples or roommates. And you see those are highly prevalent from 15 to 34. And then after people have their kids and they move out. And then single adults, so people living alone. And what we found with this splitting is that households with children, and these are, the y-axis is percentage points. So this is, say, if people had children, 50% of households 35 to 39 had children. This is 50.4%. So we found that when splitting households, we find that more people across pretty much the before 49 range we have more households with children. And then as we enter some of the later years of people's lives or households' lives, that fewer households actually have children and that more households have multiple adults with no children. And that also across the age range that we have a higher number of households with single adults, actually, indicating that a lot of the households that were forming previously as like full PUMS records that were estimated, that when we split them out, that a lot of people were staying either with older family members or individuals who were the primary householder, and then moving out with their families into the different housing arrangements if they were to be split out. And then we also compared this to the 2000 PUM sample because, as I had mentioned, house headship rates have been falling over time. And so we wanted to see if we were to split out these households, how that would impact actually that structural change over time. And we did see that the number of households with children, very interestingly, like the number of households with children for much older families was actually increased now, demonstrating that people are having children later in time. And then even when we break out these families, that there are even more households with children in later years. But that there's also more roommate or couple households forming in early years of people's lives, that 15 to 19 to 30 to 34. And so a general overview, but some questions that had come up as I was pursuing this research had to do with a broader definition of multi-generational households. Can we consider 2-generation households as multi-generational? And how does that affect the work? At what age do children count towards overcrowding? A small child that sleeps in a crib in their parents' bedroom, like, does that count as overcrowding if there's 3 people in a 1 bedroom? And the context of the housing units that people live in. There's different kinds of 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms. And if there's more space, does that actually make it feel less overcrowded, or are people less likely to move into different housing arrangements if they're financially able to? So yeah, that's an overview. And thanks. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, ask me later, or send me an email. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brandon. That's great and really interesting and information. I oftentimes use the crowding variable. So our next speaker is Brielle Bryan, and Brielle is an assistant professor of sociology at Rice University. She studies inequality and barriers to opportunity in the United States, with an emphasis on racial inequalities in the role of the criminal justice system. And she's going to talk about discrimination, felony convictions, and housing and neighborhood factors. So I'm going to turn it over to her.
Brielle, I think you're muted.
You're muted, Brielle.
There we go. How's that?
No, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so yes, this, as noted, this is a presentation on a project trying to understand how neighborhood level factors influence the extent of discrimination that individuals with felony convictions face in the private housing market. So this project is motivated in large part by the fact that there is a large share of the American population, about 8% of all adults in the US, who have a felony conviction record. And there's prior work demonstrating that this population experiences elevated levels of housing instability that can't be explained away by the standard mechanisms you might think about. So there's this leftover sort of black box of what's going on with this set of individuals who experience elevated housing instability relative to other people who look just like them in every other way. And so part of my hypothesis here is that rental market discrimination by landlords in the rental market is part of what's happening here. And the reason I want to investigate this is because it is legally permissible in the vast majority of the US for landlords to deny somebody housing when they apply for a rental unit because of their criminal history. There are a few cities and 2 states that all within the last 5 years really have adopted policies putting some sort of limits on whether and when landlords can use information about criminal history when deciding whether or not to rent to someone. But these are small cases, and in the vast majority of the country, there are no limits on it whatsoever. And so as a result, it is not at all uncommon to see rental housing ads that look like this, where there will be some sort of statement explicitly saying that individuals with felony convictions will not be considered for the unit. Now, you've likely heard about the housing problems faced by individuals with eviction records, thanks in large part to the work of Matthew Desmond and the Eviction Lab, but the housing challenges of individuals with conviction records have received far less widespread attention. So in light of this, I've conducted a large experimental study that is designed to gauge the amount of housing discrimination that individuals with felony conviction records face in the private rental market. And so this is the top line question, is just how much discrimination do individuals who acknowledge a conviction record face, but then also how is it moderated by individual level characteristics, and of particular interest for the paper I'm presenting today. And this session is, how does the extent of the discrimination that these individuals with felony conviction records, how does the extent of discrimination they experience vary across different types of neighborhoods and places? So let me talk a little bit more about how exactly I gathered these data, because the first part of this is not related to the ACS, but you'll soon see how and where I pull in the ACS data. So I'm using what's called a correspondence test design. This is similar to, if you're familiar at all with studies of employment and labor market discrimination, where resumes might be sent out to different employers and different characteristics are changed. I'm using the same approach, but I'm instead responding to housing ads on Craigslist. So I send email inquiries pretending to be an interested renter to different units and see if I get a response back about how to move forward with seeing a unit and potentially applying. So I sent out these emails across the 40 largest cities in the US, according to the 2020 census. And from all of these, what I've collected is the price of the unit. Of particular interest today, the location of the unit, so exact address when available, and when not available, the PIN on Google Maps that is put in by whoever's posting the unit. And then I also have the full text of the ad, and then the text of any email responses received back. So for how I collected the data and the emails I actually sent out, I had a couple of different scenarios and multiple test conditions. What I will focus on today is this sentence highlighted in sort of dark red lettering that is how I indicated felony conviction status. So using an approach that individuals with felony convictions have shared with me, they often use. I just included in these emails a statement very bluntly that says, I want to let you know that I have a 2-year-old or 5-year-old, etc. Felony conviction, but no arrest since. Is that a problem, or would you be willing to consider an application from me? And the reason I indicate it this way is because individuals with felony convictions are often counseled to do this, because if you don't state it up front and you just apply for a unit, you're likely to be rejected, and that means that you have put in an application fee and a background check fee that you've lost, and you lose them over and over and over again for every unit you apply to. So the approach here is to flag that up front to see if it's worth proceeding and worth putting in the application fee for a unit. Now, in order to actually do this and hopefully avoid detection by individuals who are posting these rental unit ads on Craigslist, I just sent one email per unit posted and went through a number of different strategies that I'm happy to talk to anybody who's interested. Happy to talk about this offline, but a lot of different things to make sure we hopefully didn't send one person multiple emails. In total, we sent a little over 26,000 emails, each one to a different unit. So queried about 26,000 units across these top 40 US cities. between November 2022 and September 2023. After taking out a few oddball ones, the analysis I'm going to show you focuses on 25,414 housing units across these 40 cities. And based on the inquiries we sent to those roughly 25,000 units, we got about 12,000 emails back. So first, I'm going to show you some top-line differences in response rate by felony status before I get into the stuff that's actually relevant today in terms of ACS and how response rates vary across neighborhoods. The first thing I will note is that there are a number of different ways you might think about gauging the difference in the response rate between emails that indicate a felony conviction and those that do not indicate any sort of felony conviction status. But what I'm going to focus on is what I'm calling the positive response rate. This is essentially non-automated response emails that indicate there may be some possibility of moving forward with an application. So these are not necessarily emails that say, no problem, you could definitely have the unit. These are just emails that indicate, sure, we can set up a showing, and that don't explicitly state that the unit is no longer available or that having a conviction record would automatically disqualify you. So when I focus on this, what I call positive response rate, I see that on the whole, nationwide, there's about a 10 percentage point response rate gap between emails that mention a felony conviction record and those that don't. But if we look across cities, there's a lot of variation. This is not an even standard story everywhere. And so I'm showing you this in part because I still need to explain what's going on across cities, but I think part of it that's of interest today may have to do with thinking about how differences in the neighborhoods in which units are located might be moderating what's happening here. So what I will focus on today is this question of neighborhood level, and I'll also show you rent, but focus on neighborhood level moderating, potential moderating characteristics. So here, what we've done is we've used the locations of these units to match them to census block groups, and then for those block groups, pulled 5-year ACS estimates for 2016 through 2020 of a variety of economic, demographic, and housing characteristics. And so I've put everything up here on the screen that we've tested for. And what I'll show you is these are the things that thus far, at least, are popping as actually being statistically significant moderators. So it is not everything by any means, but there's an interesting story happening here. And I should note, in case it's not already clear, this is very much work in progress. So I'm eager for any suggestions and ideas that people have. But for now, I will note that I'm about to show you predicted probabilities that come out of logistic regression models, where I include city level fixed effects, so to help account for that big variation across cities, so that we can really focus on what's going on within cities across different types of neighborhoods. So city level fixed effects and a number of other controls. And so now let me show you some predicted probability differences that come out of those logistic regression models. So here, this is not an ACS measure, but I will put it up to help compare to some of the neighborhood level measures I'm about to show you. So this is just showing you the interaction between felony conviction status, so those emails that do mention having a felony, and the price of the rental unit in itself. The broad story here is that across the board, the more expensive a rental unit is, the more likely you are to receive a response. But what we see in this blue line is that there's a steeper increase for individuals who don't mention a felony conviction record. So the result is that at the lower end of the housing market, so less expensive units, there is a sizable gap between people who mention a felony and those who do not in their response rate. But the size of that gap increases as the unit price increases. And we see not exactly the same, but somewhat similar stories when we look at what's happening at the neighborhood level. So here, rather than thinking about individual apartment or housing unit rent, we're looking at neighborhood level median rent. So again, this is neighborhood defined based on census block group. And what we see here is the same general story. Essentially at the lower end of the market in neighborhoods with lower median rent. And I should note that this is your standardized rent within the city. So relative to all neighborhoods within the city and neighborhoods with lower rent, we do see a response rate gap. So people without felony convictions are more likely to get a response than those with felony convictions. But the size of that gap grows substantially at the higher end and in higher end neighborhoods with higher median rent. And the same story is true for median home values as well. So the direction of the lines varies a little bit, but again, the general story is that we are seeing discrimination across the board in terms of the sort of value of neighborhoods based on rent and home values. But the more expensive a neighborhood is, the larger that response rate gap between individuals who mention a felony and those who do not. And the sort of similar thing is happening with neighborhood poverty level, but not exactly. This one is very interesting because what it reveals is that in the most impoverished neighborhoods, so really once you get above 50% of residents within a block group being below the poverty threshold, in these most impoverished neighborhoods, we don't actually see a statistically significant difference in the response rate between in these emails that mention a felony and those that don't. Really, where we're picking up these differences is in less impoverished neighborhoods. So this is not exactly as what I was showing you with the other graphs, but it's the same general story that the neighborhood level sort of economic well-being and economic advantage seems to have a lot to do with what's going on with response rates. One of the last two things I'll show you before I wrap it up is what happens when we look at percent of residents within a block group who are Black non-Hispanic. And here what we see is it's not as stark a picture as with poverty, but it's similar. Once we get to the very, very far end, if we were looking at a block group, the hypothetical block group, to be more honest, that is 100% Black non-Hispanic, there you can see that there is technically there appears to be a response rate gap, but it's not statistically significant. Instead, it's in the less Black, closer to 0% Black non-Hispanic block groups where we see larger difference in your likelihood of receiving some sort of positive response to your inquiry about a unit, with individuals with felony convictions experiencing a greater disadvantage in those less diverse neighborhoods. And then finally, I will put this up because this is not ACS data. I should note this is violent crime rate for 9 cities in our sample, pulled directly from police data, but I'm just putting it up because I assume that anybody interested in housing and neighborhood stuff who's here might be interested in this. And we're seeing sort of a similar story with violent crime rate in that in neighborhoods with little to no violent crime, there's a larger and a statistically significant difference in the response rate for people who mention a felony conviction versus those who don't. But once you get to high crime neighborhoods, the size of that gap decreases such that it's no longer statistically significant. For now, I want to briefly acknowledge there's still a lot more to do. First of which is noting that we've not yet explored any nonlinearities or potential threshold effects here. And so this is very much something on our to-do list, and any suggestions are very welcome. And we have a number of other things we plan to look into as well to think about what might be happening across neighborhoods as well as across markets with regard to property ownership and vacancy rate, policy context, etc. But for now, I will wrap up, and I want to acknowledge a number of people and funders that made this project possible, and just put up my contact information and my co-authors' information. Any questions, suggestions, comments you have are very welcome. And now I will wrap it up and say thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. An excellent presentation. Got me thinking of a lot of things from a lot of my graduate school work, and really appreciate it. And again, if you have questions, just put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end. And now I'm going to turn it to Eric Gartland. He's a research analyst at the Housing and Income Securities team at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. His research and data analysis focuses on housing hardships among renters and low-income and federal rental assistance programs. And he's going to talk about families and federal rent assistance. Rental assistance. Go ahead, Eric.
Great, thanks, Keith. Yeah, so as Keith mentioned, I'm a research analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I'm presenting on a report we put out a few months ago on where families using federal rental assistance live. And I co-authored this report with my incredible colleagues, Alicia Mazzara and Will Fisher. So a bit of background on the research. We were interested in where HUD-assisted households live in the 100 largest, most populous metro areas. And specifically within that analysis, looking at which HUD programs provide the greatest neighborhood choice for participants. So at the neighborhood level, we looked at poverty rate and population density by race and ethnicity, and focused on the 3 largest federal rental assistance programs. So that includes housing choice vouchers, project-based rental assistance, and public housing, which combined account for roughly 90% of all HUD-assisted households. We also dug into differences across household types. So in addition to all of those HUD-assisted households, we also looked at families with children, families of color with children, and households including a person with a disability. So quick note on the data sources. I know that's why we're all here today. So, that driving question, research question was the location and neighborhood characteristics of HUD-assisted households. And so how we accomplished that was merging tract level census data with HUD administrative data. And so for the neighborhood poverty rate and renter occupied units by gross rent, we used 5-year 2021 ACS data, and then relied on the 2020 decennial census for the population density by race and ethnicity, and then merged that with 2020 HUD microdata on households receiving federal rental assistance that we obtained through a special research agreement with HUD. So I'll run through a few key definitions that I'll be referencing throughout the presentation. The first of which is low poverty neighborhoods, which we defined as census tracts with a poverty rate below 10%. And then high poverty areas, which were tracts with a poverty rate of 30% or higher. And then we also looked at a measure of voucher affordable units, which we define as the total number of rental units that hypothetically should be affordable to a person using a housing voucher, which we calculated by finding rental units that have a rent below that area's small area fair market rent, which HUD sets at the zip code level. So some key findings across all of those 100 metro areas included in the analysis. We found that over half of public housing residents live in high poverty neighborhoods, which often reflected local patterns of both economic and racial segregation. And households assisted through project-based rental assistance, we found that this program provides a critical source of rental assistance in a broader range of neighborhoods compared to public housing, but really found that renters in the housing choice voucher program were more likely to live in low poverty neighborhoods and less likely to live in high poverty areas compared to those other 2 programs. And then within that housing voucher program, specifically renters with a tenant-based voucher that they use in the private rental market were the most likely to live in low poverty, least likely to live in high poverty areas. So just show a chart with the numbers behind all of those key findings I just explained. So this shows the share of households in the 100 most populous metro areas by rental assistance program. On the left, the percentage in low poverty areas, and then on the right, the share in high poverty areas. So you can see right at the top right, those using tenant-based vouchers, nearly 1 in 4 live in low poverty areas, which was the highest among those programs. And then in the bottom right, those public housing residents, nearly or slightly over half living in high poverty areas, kind of shows that full range across programs. And also in comparing housing voucher assisted households versus the location of voucher affordable units, we found that the housing voucher program falls well short of its potential to provide access to low poverty areas. So you can see there on the left, 22% of voucher assisted households live in low poverty areas across those 100 metro areas. But a little over a third of voucher affordable units are in these low poverty areas, which indicates there's a lot of room for additional voucher use in these neighborhoods. And then on the flip side of that, roughly the same percent of voucher assisted households live in high poverty neighborhoods, which is significantly higher than the share of voucher affordable units in these neighborhoods. So as part of the report, we wanted to dig into specific metro areas to kind of illustrate the broader findings for each of these three rental assistance programs. So we looked at public housing residents in the Washington, D.C. metro area, households assisted through the project-based rental assistance program in the Los Angeles metro area, and then finally voucher assisted households in the Milwaukee metro area. So I'll dig into each of those findings quickly. And just to orient you, this is a map. This is a screenshot from an interactive map that we created as part of this report to allow readers to really explore all the data at the neighborhood level and kind of look at what the data looks like in their own community. And so part of that interactive map is showing population density by race and ethnicity. So here you can see each of those orange dots representing 20 individuals who identify as Black, and then the blue dots representing 20 individuals that represent or identify as a white person. I really just wanted to show this before digging into the actual location of public housing residents, because I think it's important to understand just a baseline understanding of how entrenched racial segregation is, not just in DC, but across many metro areas that we looked at in this analysis, and how that really shapes the location of where public housing residents really live. And a lot of that is shaped by long history of racist and exclusionary housing policies, things like redlining and restrictive covenants that really shaped the demographics that we see in this map and across the country. And so when you add in where public housing residents live, each of these purple squares representing 12 public housing households using public housing, and you can see it really just overlays a lot, right? Shaped very dramatically by the racial segregation that we see in the DC metro area. And I'll also note this reflects the unique history of the public housing program itself. A lot of the public housing complexes were initially built separately for white and Black residents. And I think we see that still reflected in these maps that I'm showing you today. So another layer of the map is the neighborhood poverty rate. So here you can see in the lighter green is a lower poverty rate, and then brighter orange representing a higher poverty rate in that neighborhood. And again, just noting that there's a lot of overlap between that, inextricably linked racial and economic segregation, and then just to show how that really shapes the location of public housing residents. You can see that a significant share of these public housing complexes are located in these higher poverty areas in the DC metro area. And just as a point of reference, just to show you what that looks like for the housing voucher program, you can see voucher assisted households, each of these purple dots representing 12 households using housing vouchers, just have access to a much broader range of neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods with lower poverty rates. So moving on to the Los Angeles metro area, you can see here again, just to show you the race, ethnicity, demographics. Los Angeles is home to the largest Latine population of any metro area, the second largest Asian population. So it's incredibly racially diverse, but also one of the most racially segregated, as you can see in this map. And we were interested in looking at how that overlaid on top of poverty rates. And so again, just to kind of show that link between racial and economic segregation, how that kind of shapes the landscape within the Los Angeles metro area, and then specifically looking at the location of households using project-based rental assistance. So each of these purple triangles on the map representing 20 households using project-based rental assistance. And we found, kind of in line with our overall findings that households using project-based rental assistance, there's still a significant share that are in higher poverty neighborhoods in the Los Angeles metro area, but still provided better access to low poverty neighborhoods compared to the public housing program. And one of our other interesting findings here is we found that project-based rental assistance in Los Angeles and nationally overwhelmingly serves older adults. So you can see here each of these bars showing the share of assisted households by the age of the household head. You can see right at the top that over 3 in 4 household heads for households using project-based rental assistance are 62 or older, really indicating that that population is overwhelmingly served by this program. And last, I'll cover this case study in Milwaukee. Again, just to show, I think part of the reason we chose it for this case study is just really visually stark. You can see just deeply entrenched racial segregation that is very apparent in the map, showing where the Black and Latino and white population live within the Milwaukee metro area. And then to add in where voucher assisted households live, you can see that that racial segregation is deeply shapes where people are able to use housing vouchers. And when you overlay that with the poverty rate map, you can see that, again, just this deep linkage of racial and economic segregation. And when you add back in voucher assisted households, just to note that a lot of the reason why voucher assisted households, while it does a better job of providing access to a broader range of neighborhoods than the other programs, still falls well short of providing access in low poverty areas. A lot of that has to do with research that shows that landlords in low poverty areas are much less likely to accept housing vouchers, sometimes explicitly discriminating against voucher assisted households, sometimes in violation of protections. And the last map I'll show, again, that voucher affordable unit measure that I mentioned earlier, each of these kind of lighter pink dots representing 12 voucher affordable units. And you can see hypothetically, there's quite a supply of voucher affordable units in these lower poverty areas, which indicates that the program could be doing a better job of broadening access to a broader range of neighborhoods for voucher assisted households. In the last chart I'll show for this case study, this shows the share of voucher assisted households living in low poverty areas in the Milwaukee metro area by the race ethnicity of the household head. Really just illustrate how vastly different the experience is for voucher assisted households based on your race and ethnicity. So you can see that nearly half of white households are able to access these low poverty areas, while less than 10% of Black households are able to access these neighborhoods. And really just illustrates the compounding effect of not just voucher discrimination, but the racial discrimination that a lot of people of color face in the private rental market. And just to wrap up with some policy recommendations, fall into a few buckets here. So the first is just expanding and improving rental assistance programs. So currently, only 1 in 4 eligible households actually receives rental assistance that they need to secure safe and stable housing. So we advocate for expanding that to all eligible households. And also the wide body of research, particularly out of Opportunity Insights, that shows that when you provide additional search assistance and things like housing navigators, it just vastly increases the odds that families and individuals are able to move to low poverty areas when they use their housing vouchers. There's also a number of reforms to make vouchers easier to use. I won't run through the entire list, but things like streamlining unit inspections and other things that make it easier for landlords to participate in the program just make it more appealing. And there's also a number of promising pilot programs for testing direct rental assistance. So this is making rental assistance look a bit more like cash and providing it directly to the tenant to then use in the private rental market. Just testing that as a possibility to maybe cut through some of the red tape that makes vouchers hard to use. and also support extending, source of income protections and other bans on discriminating against households trying to use vouchers, in addition to just stronger fair housing enforcement to prevent discrimination of all kinds. So the next bucket is just, building and preserving affordable housing. As I'm sure many people on this call know, there is just quite a dearth of affordable housing that makes navigating the private rental market incredibly hard in many places. So just building and preserving housing in a wide range of neighborhoods to help lower housing costs across the rental market. And then also based on our findings, finding a good balance of project and tenant basing rental assistance. So providing the flexibility to use vouchers in the private market, but also in some cases, using project basing to tie rental assistance to a hard unit, particularly in tighter rental markets where that may be needed. And then finally, just multiple ways we can invest in under-resourced neighborhoods, including just improving housing conditions for all people that live in higher poverty areas and improve the quality of life for everybody in those communities. And then a number of investments beyond housing that are, beyond the scope of my research here, but things like improving access to quality schools, jobs, public transit, among many other things. So I'll wrap up there. My contact information is on this slide, and then I can also drop some links in the chat to the report and the interactive map if people are interested, but I'll pass it back to Keith.
Keith, I think you're muted.
All right, I muted myself. But Natasha Moody is a senior research associate. She's going to be speaking next at the Housing Assistance Council, and she's co-authored a research report conducted in collaboration with Fannie Mae titled A Methodological Approach to Estimating Residential Heirs Property. And her research projects focus on access to affordable housing in rural communities and the intersection of housing, land tenure, and the racial wealth gap. And she's going to talk about heirs properties today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Keith. Hello, everyone. So hopefully you can see my presentation. My name is Natasha Moody, as Keith said, and I conduct this research alongside our moderator, Dr. Keith Wiley, and Lance George, and Justin Stackey. And so the Housing Assistance Council is a national nonprofit that supports affordable housing and community development across rural America. We do that through training and technical assistance. We have an in-house CDFI in our loan fund, Research and Information Division, which is where Keith and I are housed. And then we have a policy team that advocates for rural housing and community needs. So today I want to talk a bit about heirs property and just want to share the definitions that we work with in case folks are unfamiliar. So heirs property is often defined as a property where the owner has died without a will or another form of estate planning, and the property is transferred to their descendants, their heirs, as undivided property. Sometimes property owners choose to leave the land and their property to multiple descendants, either with or without a will. And the cases where there is a will and they choose to leave it to multiple descendants, sometimes the heirs of the property do not complete the formal transfer of the title needed after the death of the original owner. In all of these cases that I just mentioned, the owners who inherit the property do not have clear titles. So the property records do not show the names of the folks who inherited the property in the title records. And without clear title, this creates a multitude of complications for the household and for the community. Property titles are required for market participation, to access loans and financial products, for insurance, and for many federal grants and programs. And not having clear title really leads to a decrease in agency for the property owners. It makes them more vulnerable to property loss through forced sales or tax sales. And there tends to be an increase in dilapidation of the property or vacancy rates in communities with high prevalences of heirs property, really all kind of accumulating potentially to a loss of generational wealth for that household. And for the community, we often as well see decreased tax base for the community. Just like to note that there's been decades of research quantifying air's property, and we've learned so much from and are informed by a lot of the research that's been done. And this is not an exhaustive list of all of the amazing researchers working in this space. So the Housing Assistance Council, in collaboration with Fannie Mae, we conducted a national report, a methodological approach to estimate residential heirs property in the United States. And we wanted to share a bit about this research as well as some calls for future research. And this research is focused specifically on residential property, so it does not include agricultural land or vacant parcels. So for this research, we use both public and private data. For the private data, we use tax and assessment data from the Intercontinental Exchange, formerly Black Knight, that we had access through the enterprise data team at Fannie Mae. And we looked in this tax and assessment data for indicators of a transfer of ownership upon an owner's death. So looking for records that showed that the record was held in the name of a deceased person and other similar indicators. We also looked for property characteristics that align with properties that often have unclear titles. So that includes things like not having a mortgage, no sale in 30 years or more, no full tax exemption, and less than average property quality and condition. And having access to the private data through this partnership was really robust because we had access to data that usually is otherwise only available on the local level. You need to contact each municipality in order to get access to that data. To have access to a robust data set really helped advance this research. We also use public data to contextualize our findings in terms of the prevalence of heirs property, residential heirs property. So we use ACS data for things like looking at population changes, housing quality, occupancy rates, and other county demographic analyses. We also use HMDA data to look at market analyses in areas and data around that in areas with high prevalence of heirs property. And having this public data using ACS data was really helpful because it is publicly available for every census tract, and being able to contextualize the findings for the property tax and assessment data. There were some considerations around the use of both of these types of data. That for the private data, the data are not publicly available in all localities, and assessment practices in localities and recordation practices are not uniform. So that led to a lot of variability in the data. In addition, that electronic data are incomplete. So particularly for many of our rural communities, and particularly across tribal lands, the data usually aren't electronic and accessible publicly. And the private data did not include demographic data, which is why it was really helpful to be able to use the ACS data. With the public data, there are varied methodologies based on the data sources. That's something to keep in mind, and also varied units of analyses. The methodological changes, between the different years of the data had to be considered, and particularly for some of our rural communities, using the county level may blur some of the results. But we still use both data sets to inform the research, and we just like to be to mention that there's inherent risk in this research, specifically identifying heirs, parcels, or properties, or even down to the census tract level, where there are areas that with a really high prevalence of heirs property can put a target on these properties and communities that may entice or inform how nefarious actors use some data to increase opportunities for exploitation and forced sale. So in our research, we do it at the county level, which aligned with the ACS data, which blurs the data, but hopefully reduces the risk of being able to pinpoint exactly where nefarious actors can go to force sales of property or acquire property for lower cost. So I want to share some more findings for the national report. These results are based on 44 states and the District of Columbia. Due to some data anomalies, we excluded 6 states from the report and from the public report. However, the findings showed first and foremost that heirs property effects, it shows up across the country. There is really no state that is not affected or has some impacts in some communities by heirs property. Across the country, country, 0.6% of all residential properties were identified as heirs property, which the total assessed value for all of the identified properties was 32 billion. And so these are very conservative estimates. However, it still is at a minimum that $32 billion in terms of home equity is tied up and inaccessible to families, to communities because of title issues. So we use some ACS data to look at the population changes. And so what we found was that in counties that did not have population decline, the percent of residential heirs property was estimated at 0.4%. However, in counties that did have population decline from 2010 to 2020, the estimate for residential heirs property was much higher at 1.6%, which is also higher than national estimate at 0.6%. Over here on the right, you can see we categorize the counties based on their prevalence of heirs property from very low prevalence to very high prevalence. And the very high prevalence and the high prevalence counties, so the counties with high and very high prevalences of heirs property, they had much higher populations living in counties with population decline. We also like to note that from our findings, there was a much higher prevalence of heirs property in rural census tracts. And so 64.6% of all identified heirs properties were in rural census tracts. So there has been a call for future research looking at community indicators in heirs property. So prior research has suggested that communities with indicators of disinvestment may have higher prevalences of heirs property. And some of those indicators include poverty rates, limited market activity, poor housing conditions, and high rates of absentee ownership. And so there's been calls for this research. There are regions that have many of these indicators of sustained disinvestment and unaddressed housing needs, and they've been identified by the FHFA duty to serve as high needs regions. That includes Middle Appalachia, Lower Mississippi Delta, tribal lands, colonial investment areas, and persistent poverty counties. So when looking at poverty rates and in persistent poverty counties, so starting with one of the region's persistent poverty counties, we looked at poverty rates across persistent poverty counties. And for every race and ethnic group across the country, poverty rates are much higher for every race and every racial group, every ethnic group across the country. Poverty rates are much higher in persistent poverty counties, as demonstrated in blue, as compared to non-persistent poverty counties in orange and for all counties in green. So just demonstrating that poverty rates impact all people in persistent poverty groups across the country. So considering that's one of the indicators of disinvestment, which I should have mentioned, pardon me, persistent poverty counties are counties with 20% or higher poverty rates over 30 years. And these are demonstrated here on this map. So we looked at the heirs property prevalence in persistent poverty counties compared to non-persistent poverty counties. And persistent poverty counties had double the residential heirs property rates as compared to non-persistent poverty counties. So a rate of 1.2%, which is also double the national estimate. So looking at other high needs regions, there we looked at the poverty rates by race and ethnicity for each of the other high needs regions. That's Middle Appalachia, Lower Mississippi Delta, federally designated tribal lands, and colonial investment areas. So these are counties, county analysis. And so we see that for Hispanic or Latino populations in Middle Appalachia had some of the highest poverty rates and followed by Black African-American residents. In the Lower Mississippi Delta, we also saw high rates also for Black and Hispanic or Latino residents. Across federally designated tribal lands, the total poverty rate was highest for that high needs region. And in terms of by race and ethnicity, the American Indian and Alaska Native populations had the highest poverty rates. And then for colonial investment areas, we also saw high poverty rates across multiple racial and ethnic groups, but want to note that the colonial investment areas are counties that include colonias, but still seeing those poverty rates in those counties across Black, American Indian and Alaska Native and Hispanic or Latino populations. So given that we see these high these high percentages of poverty rates, which should have mentioned, compared to the national average at the time of the study was around 12%. So we're seeing poverty rates in the 20s and 30% compared to the national poverty rate, 12% at the time. Aligns with some of the prior research calling for research in high needs regions around prevalence of heirs property tied to other indicators of different disinvestment. So wants to share some of the research that's been published so far from other researchers around this. And so in Appalachian region, counties in the Appalachian region had heirs property prevalences from 0.9% to 23% per county. For counties that include colonias, we saw rates around 0.4% to 0.8% per county, and across Mississippi Delta, 0.3% to 4.1% per county. And while census tract analyses would help to really maybe pinpoint some of the areas that really have the highest areas of the indicated disinvestment and being able to look at heirs property, as you mentioned earlier, census tract level research around heirs property can lead to pinpointing specific areas that can be vulnerable to land loss. So just want to note that federally designated tribal lands were not included in that prior slide, mainly because there are multiple property structures across Native nations. And so they may not specifically align with heirs property. In addition, a lot of those records are either held with the tribe or the Bureau of Internal Affairs. And so access to those data to conduct this type of research are less accessible than some other data sources. The findings around colonias, colonias include unrecorded and recorded deeds for contracts, which are not exactly heirs property, but also unrecorded deeds for contracts. Contracts for deeds would not be in the public record to be included in this data analyses. As I mentioned before, county analyses do blur the data in terms of showing which areas might be most impacted, and that kind of analyses should be conducted by local trusted partners. However, wanting to be clear that when conducting analyses in smaller geographies, that will increase risk for communities. So keeping that in mind about how the data are presented. So we hope to be able to answer the call for further research needed focused on heirs property in high needs regions and relationship with other indicators of disinvestment, so that targeted solutions around addressing the other areas, the other indicators with impacts of disinvestment can also consider how to address heirs property and support heirs property owners in communities that are impacted, for households that are impacted, but particularly for the high needs regions. So thank you for that. And with that, I will turn it back over to Keith.
Thank you, Natasha, and thanks everybody for great presentations. I really enjoyed listening to them, and it was always a lot of information, and we have several questions here. I'll just try to go over a couple of them here, and I even have one or two myself, but I'll save mine to the end because mine are never as good as everybody else's questions. I got a first question, I think, for Brielle. It's how did you manually go about coding 12,000 emails? That's a huge undertaking. And what kind of process did you use for doing that for your kind of a research in email?
This is why I had that long list of names up at the end. I did not do that by myself, and I do not claim to have the ability to do that by myself. I was very lucky to have some grant support that allowed me to hire a team of wonderful undergraduate RAs. And I was working with a postdoc who's a qualitative researcher who helped in developing a coding strategy and code book, and oversaw those RAs in helping them to actually read through all of those emails and code them appropriately. So it was with the help of lots of people is the short answer.
Thank you. That's great. And just one more here. That is a lot of work. I can only imagine. Can economic development reduce the response rate? Was another question. Was it related? I mean, I know you had the income, but yeah.
I saw this, and I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if the commenter meant the gap in the response rate. I don't know. For now, what I will say is that I'm not quite sure about the policy levers yet. If anything, the findings so far suggest that economic development might actually make it worse. And perhaps that's what this question was getting at, in that it appears that the sort of higher rent, more advantaged neighborhoods are places where perhaps because of their desirability, there is a larger discrimination and perhaps on the part of landlords, the either the freedom or the willingness to discourage some applicants, presumably because there are likely to be lots of others. And so this is where, economic development is always a admirable goal, but it's always also important to think about who is most likely to benefit from such things. And from what the results are showing so far, it's hard to imagine that people with this sort of negative mark on their record are likely to be people that will benefit from improvements in retail space and rental unit quality that are likely to lead to higher rents and higher home values in certain neighborhoods.
Great. And this is another question. I'm going to try to paraphrase a couple of these. It's asking, I think it's asking about the LA, I got the county or the city, but it's asking if efforts for incarceration, reentry, and employment and housing, can they help with this, help gaining access? I think it's both for, Brianna, maybe Eric too, but can it help those kind of efforts about reentry? Can they help address that discrimination, do you think?
It's hard to know. I can say in the labor market, there have been, people may be familiar with the phrase "ban the box." These are policies that have been passed mostly at the state level and in quite a few states at this point that prohibit employers from asking about criminal history on applications, with the hopes that preventing the collection of that data will reduce discrimination against job holders with criminal records. But the research on the effectiveness of these policies is actually pretty mixed. It suggests that maybe it increases employment for some subset of people with criminal records, but on the whole, it might actually reduce employment for particularly Black, but also Hispanic job seekers, especially men who in these places where they can't make it clear that they don't have a criminal record. And so employers may assume that they do instead and use statistical discrimination. And so some of these policies might have unintended consequences. And the same could be true in the housing market. What I can say so far is that the policy levers that are being used are similar to ban the box, and that it's local ordinances being passed saying housing landlords cannot ask about this sort of information, or they cannot ask until later in the process. But that might have unintended consequences. I think what's more likely to be successful is probably programs that are geared on actually matching individuals with records to private landlords who know exactly who they're renting to and who are eager to help. So there are a few demonstration projects like this that are geared towards helping people who are reentering, maybe take an extra room or an apartment unit, a garage apartment unit on somebody's property, so that they can build sort of a rental history that they can refer to. And I think these sorts of policies might be most likely to succeed. I don't know the specifics of LA, unfortunately, but I'd be happy to chat offline later if anyone would like to reach out to me.
Okay, I think this one is for Eric and some metro areas. I'm going to paraphrase here. It's talking about housing being so expensive and that I guess people not qualifying for assistance, almost like a workforce housing issue. And also maybe just in general, how might that kind of expense impact like the voucher program and stuff like that, right? It's being accepted and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's a good question. And just as like a baseline understanding, so HUD determines eligibility for rental assistance based on 80% of the area median income based on the county level. So if your county, say you live in San Francisco or a place where the median income is much higher, the eligibility may be closer to 200% of the federal poverty line. So it is adjusted for the median income of that specific county where the person would be using their rental assistance. But as I mentioned, right, because only a quarter of the eligible population actually receives rental assistance, a lot of that ends up being targeted at people at the lower end of the income spectrum. The vast majority being people that HUD defines as extremely low income, which is either 50% of the poverty line or 30% of the area median income, whichever is higher. So that's part of the issue. Is I think we really need to expand these programs so we're reaching people that need it, that may be closer to that income threshold that I think they're talking about in their question.
Okay. And I've got another question. This one for Natasha. What about the relationship between lack of access to services like banks or other things, and maybe distrust and stuff that might help, be related to heirs property, the relationship in places like Appalachia, other places where there's either no facilities or there's a distrust of them?
Yes, thank you, Keith. So, and thank you for the person who asked that question. Definitely, I think that there's been attention on legal deserts. So we see a lot of our rural communities, particularly legal deserts, where there is one attorney for over 1,000 residents, and that attorney may not be a real estate attorney or an attorney that's maybe a criminal lawyer that can't do the transactions needed for clearing title. In addition, that some of our, particularly in our rural communities, they're in areas that they've never had an attorney in the community, and so we're looking at homes that have been in families for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 generations. And what does it look like to maybe think about considerations for introducing legal services and what really pathways and options are available for those families, given that there hasn't been legal access there. There's also considerations about the cost of legal, even in areas where there are attorneys. Is it still accessible even if the attorney's in the community? So what's the cost? What's the wait list? We hear about that, particularly in urban areas. And then lastly, thinking about, in particular, mixed status families. We hear about this in terms of what legal services are available around support for estate planning or for other property-related legal services when there's a mixed status family, and which attorneys are able to assist and to provide those services. So there are amazing attorneys across the country in the Heirs Property Practitioner Network who do this work every day. They're on the ground supporting communities and looking for ways to expand services. And we're glad to be partners and supporters of that work, but there's definitely more that needs to be done to continue to expand legal services to help support families.
Okay, thank you all. And I got one more for Brandon. Your research on headship counts. We used to do a good bit of work, and a lot of times in rural areas, we were trying to find areas where grandparents were taking care of grandkids, or how you talked about using your data on tribal lands. It's a little different. Maybe there might be multiple generational families and stuff. And just first of all, did you do any of that on rural areas, maybe more rural areas? And what are your thoughts about using it for other things, to maybe more get it at homelessness or near homelessness, where that's a play, or where these other circumstances are at work? Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we looked into the entire state of Massachusetts. I presented just on the MAPC, the Eastern region, but we looked in the Berkshires and Franklin County, which are very sparsely populated relative to Eastern Massachusetts. I think there's a lot more work to be done to get into that research on those kinds of household formation, because I wasn't looking necessarily as deeply at those households. And I think the way the census defined multi-generational was limiting in the way that I could use that variable. It assumed that a specific type of household in that variable. There is a method that researchers at IPUMS developed to kind of break out PUMS respondents into less rigidly defined multi-generational households. So actually looking at grandparent and child and grandchild households, or 2-generation households that were significantly wide in age disparity. So that would be something to recreate, to look at it a little bit more in depth.
Thank you. And look, I think we're almost out of time, so I could talk to you guys forever about this. There's some more questions here if you would like to answer them, but I really appreciate it. Thank you all for presenting, and I always learn a lot here. And the next sessions will be coming up at 4, and one will be on combining ACS with other survey data, and the other one will be on ACS methods and using ACS data for planning. Again, all of this is kind of related to even what we're doing here. And so I just really appreciate you. Those sessions will start at 4, so we just have a 10-minute break. So thank you so much for your presentations, and thank you everybody for being here. And I'm going to get off here now because I think it's like they're going to run me out. We're running out of time. But thank you so much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Sorry, guys. I couldn't get them all in. I wanted to ask
Oh, that's
one
fine.
response to the felony